Hello, I'm Farley Katz. This talk summarizes my article, From Voynich to the Beinecke, The Trail of Ownership. The Voynich manuscript was acquired by William Michael Voynich around 1911 to 12, in circumstances that are still not clear. Voynich was a rare book dealer and tried to sell the manuscript for large amounts, but died in 1930 without selling it. In 1969, H.P. Krauss, another rare book dealer, owned the book and gave it to the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale. Between 1930, when Voynich died, and 1969, when it was donated to the Beinecke, the manuscript had several owners. Although its history between 1930 and 1969 has been described in books and articles, none has gotten it exactly correct. For example, one book states, quote, when Voynich died in 1930, his cipher manuscript was inherited by his wife, and on her death in 1960, she left it to Anne Nill, her lifelong friend and Voynich's former business associate. This, as we shall see, is not correct, and the trail of ownership is more complicated than has been previously understood. That is undoubtedly because some of the key documents in the ownership trail were not available or were not understood. For example, Voynich's will and his wife's probate records have not been previously published. I have obtained copies of those from the New York State Surrogates Court and have posted them online. The URL is in the article. Although his wife's will was published in 2011, it appears to have been misunderstood. Besides setting the trail of ownership straight, there are a number of interesting circumstances surrounding the manuscript's travel from the Voynich to the Beinecke, which I would like to discuss. First, the cast of characters. Wilfrid Michael Voynich was born in Poland in 1865. He was an intellectual and became a revolutionary. He emigrated to England, where he met and eventually married Ethel Lillian Boole. He became a leading rare book dealer with a shop in London. In the 1920s, he and his wife moved to the United States, where he set up a bookstore in New York City. Ethel Lillian Boole. Ethel was born in Ireland in 1864, but grew up in England. Her father, incidentally, created Boolean algebra, but he died shortly after she was born. She became librarian at Queen's College in England and later inherited money. That allowed her to study music composition. She also became interested in Russian revolutionary politics. Ethel is primarily known for The Gadfly, a novel published in 1897 about a mid-19th century Italian revolutionary. The novel was translated into Russian and other languages and became a bestseller in Russia. Anne Margaret Nill was born in Buffalo in 1894. She went to work for Voynich sometime in the 1920s and became the manager of his New York bookstore. In his will, Voynich called her his, quote, collaborator in the development of the book business from the beginning. She became very close with Ethel, and after Voynich's death in 1930, she and Ethel shared an apartment in New York City. Voynich died on March 19, 1930. Among his assets was the Voynich manuscript, which he had tried unsuccessfully to sell for $100,000. He left a handwritten will. In the will, after a few cash bequests, he left the remainder of his estate, 60% to Lillian and 40% to Anne. But he made a special provision for the Voynich manuscript. He said that it was his wish to sell it to a public institution, and to make that easier, he set up a committee of 5 persons, 3 professors who had previously studied the manuscript, along with Ethel and Anne. For their work, each was to receive $3,000, and additional sums were to be paid to others. Finally, the remainder was to go 60% to Ethel and 40% to Anne. The Committee of 5 has been misunderstood. It has been stated, for example, that Voynich, quote, stipulated before his death that a buyer would have to be agreed by a committee of 5 persons, or that, quote, no private collector should ever be allowed to buy it for any sum. In fact, Voynich's will simply expressed his wish that the manuscript be sold to an institution, which was not binding on the executor. A private sale at any price was not forbidden. The committee's charge, moreover, was vague, quote, to act as a committee in connection of the sale in order to make the sale, quote, easier. But it was not given control over the sale. Anne was administrator of Voynich's estate. Voynich had significant debts, and she continued operation of the New York bookstore to try to pay those debts off. Her letters to the manager of the London office, which are preserved at the Grolier Club in New York City, make fascinating reading. She worked tirelessly to sell books, but the demand for rare books in the Depression was bleak, and it was not certain that she could make rent each month. We see this in some of her letters. In 1931, she wrote that the looming estate taxes for Voynich, quote, make me shiver in my bones, for unless something remarkable happens in the meantime, we shall not be able to pay them in full. The next year, things were worse. Quote, business came to a dreadful and awful standstill. The days of the office are numbered, I fear. We have been living on borrowed money, more or less, since I wrote you. Neil considered closing the office and operating out of the apartment she shared with Ethel and seeking a job. There were additional problems in selling the manuscript. Voynich had tried to sell it for $100,000, paying $3,000 to each member of the committee of 5, or $15,000 in total, assumed the manuscript would sell for a huge amount. In 1930, this was not possible. The manuscript was appraised in the estate at only $19,400, and there is no indication there were any buyers even at that low price. Anne contacted the members of the committee and asked them to reduce their payments from $3,000, or 3% of $100,000, to 3% of whatever the manuscript sold for, which they agreed to, but the manuscript never sold. 30 years after Voynich's death, on July 27, 1960, Ethel Voynich died. The manuscript was still unsold and kept in a bank vault. Ethel had named Anne her executor. In her will, she left Anne certain specific assets. Those included her, quote, clothing, furniture, books, jewelry, and other personal effects. This did not include the Voynich manuscript. Even assuming that the manuscript was a, quote, book, it was not a personal effect. Personal effects are assets closely associated with the person, such as clothing, jewelry, etc. It would certainly not include a percentage interest in a rare manuscript kept as inventory by her husband and kept in a bank vault for 30 years. The probate records, in fact, confirm that the manuscript was not a personal effect. They list personal effects as only Ethel's clothing, and they have a separate listing for jointly owned assets under which the estate's 60% interest in the Voynich manuscript is included. Thus, we know that Ethel did not leave her interest in the manuscript to Anne. Ethel's will, in fact, left the residue of her estate, which included her interest in the manuscript, to her dear friend Winifred Gay, quote, who, though not legally adopted by me, has always been considered by me as a daughter. Lillian's 60% interest in the manuscript thus was left to Winifred, a resident of England. Transferring that percentage interest to Winifred, however, would have caused problems because there was not sufficient cash in the estate to pay estate debts. This problem was solved when on July 12, 1961, Anne sold the Voynich manuscript to Hans P. Krauss, probably the greatest book dealer of the 20th century. Her notation of the sale simply states sold for $24,500, quote, cash. She was legally able to sell the manuscript since she owned 40% of it, and she was the executor of Ethel's estate, which held title to the remaining 60%. As we can see in this analysis of the estate's assets and distributions, based on probate records, the entire $24,500 sales price was deposited to an estate account. The estate's debts were paid, and cash was distributed to Anne and Winifred including their respective shares of the proceeds from the sale to Krauss. Interestingly, Krauss stated in his autobiography that Anne was to receive half of his profit on resale of the manuscript if he resold it later. But there's no indication of that in Anne's notation, which simply says $24,500 cash. That is unusual since she was so careful with finances and would have noted it if the estate had a contingent interest. In any event, Krauss did not resell the manuscript. He held it for 8 years. He tried to sell it for $100,000, and when no seller could be found, for $160,000. In 1969, however, he abruptly gave up and donated the book to the Beinecke Library at Yale. He also gave his personal collection of manuscript Spanish Americana to the Library of Congress that year. Although he did not mention it in his autobiography, these gifts almost certainly were triggered by the fact that Congress had changed the tax law. Prior to 1970, one could donate any type of property and get a deduction of its full fair market value. But starting in 1970, the deduction would be reduced by the amount of gain that would not have been long-term capital gain if the asset were sold. In the case of inventory, such as the Voynich manuscript, Krauss could deduct its fair market value, perhaps as much as $160,000, if the gift were made in 1969, but only his cost, $24,500, if the gift were made in 1970 or later. Assuming he was in the top income tax bracket, a deduction of $160,000 could have been worth as much as $123,000 to him in taxes saved. But if his deduction was limited to his cost, or $24,500, that would have been worth at most $19,000. We thus may be comfortable in concluding that the upcoming change in the tax law triggered the gift. Thank you, and if there are any questions, please ask.